Greetings and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainability around the world and across Africa. I'm George Mutalemwa, moderating this session on behalf of the Africa Peace and Development Network, MAMA. Our theme today is learning to build peace. Education first pedagogy for technology integration in conflict-sensitive contexts. We have discussed a bit about technology, etc. And now we have an expert here with us who I'm introducing now, Martin Khamala, who is a Kenyan animator and interactive systems designer. He is working on his PhD in computer science technology at the Technical University of Kenya. And Martin has been with us before on this call. And it was through his contribution that we felt we should invite him to give us a talk. And in a special way, he's very close to Odoch Pido and Donna Pido, who kindly recommended him also to speak to us. And I'm also happy to also inform you that I met him just 2 days ago, together with Donna Pido and Odoch Pido. So this is really amazing that, Global Peace, we met in Nairobi and we discussed a little bit. So today, we are so privileged to have you, Martin. I welcome now to start your presentation. And I welcome everybody on board to join us in our conversation regarding technology and peace building. So thank you, and please, you're welcome to start. Join me, please, in welcoming Martin Khamala.
Thank you very much. So I'll try and share my screen.
Yes, please.
And yes, let me know if you can see. I don't know.
It's coming.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I just need to. I think I may reshare it.
Shared.
Okay. For some reason, I don't see it.
I can see it, Martin. I can see it.
Okay.
We see it.
I'll stop sharing because I myself don't see it. Then I'll share again.
Yes. Okay. Good.
So important.
Yes. So I'm sharing again. Okay. Okay, so I'll use my slide on this side. If I go to the second screen, you can see, I think that's the second one.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. So let me introduce the subject the way Mutalemwa introduced it. I think he's very accurate in the way that he explained what he's asked me to talk about. And I just want to say that learning to build peace is actually a new subject for me in many ways. Normally, my experience, even with the research work we do with Donna and Prof. Odoch, it revolves around learning and technology. But the idea that learning can be a tool to build peace is something I had to think about. And I thought it was a very interesting challenge, in part because it just presented what I realize is an important value to Kenyans. When you look at our history, when you look at our current context, and even future context generationally, it's actually a very central value to our existence and coexistence within the country. So this ironically has been something we've not really had a strong focus on, but in this forum, it has come into play, and I really appreciate that about the forum. So this talk, in some ways, is somewhat introductory. It's not deep, and I focus mainly on the problem and the solution in terms of what currently exists, and possibly when we talk about it, we can go deeper into that. I don't get into the issues regarding impact, for example, how the solutions impact on policy or can improve policy. That I thought for 25 minutes, which is roughly how long I've timed this presentation to be, I thought that might be a bit, that might be a second presentation. And examples, I haven't gone deep into examples of the solutions that are currently out there and some in which we're using for research. Again, this can be the subject of future presentations. But for now, I wanted to focus on the nature of the problem and the solution, and partly because that's actually what goes under the radar. And I'll explain why as we go. I mean, in many scenarios, like institutional management, governmental level management, to some extent, you can also say the global conflict management, don't really look at learning as a means by which we can actually introduce peace. And this is just a discovery I'm making from the literature. I could even be wrong. Using a tool like education first as a means by which we can achieve peace. And we have a lot of wars even bubbling right now in the Middle East, the Far East, Russia, these countries. And you wonder to what extent education is playing a part in not only, let's say, spicing and fueling the war, but could play a part in, let's say, building peace generationally. Many of these wars are generational, but that's another discussion. So I'm focused mainly on the region. I would say Africa, but more specifically Kenya, where I have a lot more experience, and East Africa to some extent, but for this presentation, Kenya, and I'll use examples which I hope will illuminate the whole thing. So the main thrust and the main argument is that education, first, as a pedagogy, is, I could say, a very powerful way of generationally building peace and avoiding violence. So I define violence in a number of different ways, but I'll first of all tell you how I'm going to go about the talk. I'll introduce the urgency, the reason why this is very important and why we must give it the highest level of attention. And then I'll talk about the purpose and the methodology I've used for this particular presentation. I'll then talk about the key terms and pedagogies, because sometimes the terminologies become very jargonish or very, you can say, technical. So in case that happens, I'll try to unpack whatever I say that looks like jargon, but you can always ask me, even interrupt me, I don't mind. I'll talk then about the definition of the problem. This is the main thrust of this talk, the problem. And then, of course, I'll talk about the solution. And my focus from the solution perspective is technology-based. So I'll look at it from a digital technology perspective. And then after that, I will conclude. So I've left out, I don't think this is exhaustive, but it just gives us a starting point, and maybe we can have enough discussion points after a 25-minute talk. So yeah, I'll get into it. I found this interesting picture, and I thought it might be a good way to start. It just kind of shows everybody's a different color and even a different shape, and has different views, speaks different languages. It sort of answers a question which I've been asked almost every single time I have to talk about learning and technology within African contexts. What is African and what is African culture? And it's also something that Donna asks me quite often, because when I use this term, she always encourages me to define what I mean by African culture. And I think it's a good one. And when I'm asked the question, it seems like something that I can answer very quickly and very automatically, being an African. But I realized it's a lot harder than I thought I than I thought answering the question. So this graphic is the one that gives the answer best. But this is, according to me, there might be better answers out there. But the best way of defining an African is not actually by the color of our skin. That's a mistake. That doesn't tell us anything about culture. The other one is by defining an African by the continent itself. Because you were born in the continent, you're African. Or because you live in the continent, you're African. There are many Africans or many people living in Africa, they don't have an African experience. And there are people in other countries. I visited Europe and I saw many people in the UK and Germany living in African situations, but they're not in Africa, and some of them have never stepped in Africa. So what is African? One of the things that seems universal when you go through the research material, the literature, is that the most diverse peoples in the history of the world, not just in the world, but in the history of the world, are Africans. And the people of the African continent in particular are the most diverse. The interesting thing about that is that it's something we know in a tacit way. It's not something that we are aware of, really. When I talk to my colleagues, my friends, the fact that we're diverse seems to go under our own radar. But you start to realize it when you leave Africa, because you realize when you go to the Far East how monolithic people seem to be. Even when you go to Europe, you realize within the Union, for example, people even think in the same way and do things in the same way, and they follow systems and practices very much in the same way. That's when you start to realize how diverse we are, not physically or by virtue of our location, but by our behavior and our practices. Now, that is interesting. And why I say it's interesting is largely because in Kenya, by and large, we live in peace. We haven't had a major war. We have internal conflicts, but these are interspersed every 5 or so years. We have them, and they're kind of related to our politics. But we have 47 tribes, and within each tribe, we have sub-tribes. In some, like in my sub-tribe, we have 17 different dialects. So there's a heavy level of variability and variety amongst the people, the languages, because the dialects also have their own languages, and the practices that they have. Yet we all live together, and we are somehow familiar with this kind of visual. And that's now explaining this picture in some ways, because an African is someone who lives in these multicultural environments and is in some ways affected in his capacity to survive or her capacity to survive because of socioeconomic reasons. That's the reason for this. And that's how I'd explain an African. Even if you're in Harlem or in London or in, let's say, Chinese or in China, if you're having this kind of experience, then you're having what we would generally term as an African experience, where you don't have sufficient levels, sufficient means to survive, but you still have to survive. And you're immersed in a multicultural environment, and you have to figure out how to make peace and communicate within the context of the social environment you exist. But we'll get deeper into that. That's just the definition I'm using. It may not be, something you agree with, or many people may not accept it, but it is, for me, utilitarian in that it allows us to come up with solutions that will help majority of the people I find within the continent that are subject to this condition that I'm talking about, the African condition. So let me get into the details of it. I want to just give you an overview again of the talk, but we'll start by contextualizing peace building in African education systems. Yeah, sorry. You can hear me? Yeah, I've moved to the next slide. Is it showing? I hope it's showing. I'm on another slide now.
Yes, it's working. Yes, it's showing.
Okay, thank you. So I want about 6 points contextualizing peace building in African education systems. We'll get into more detail. I want to talk about the role of education first approaches and why I think this could be a way of tackling some of our problems in mitigating microsocial violence. That microsocial word, it looks like jargon again, but what I mean by microsocial is not global. I'm really talking about solutions on the ground, bottoms-up kind of thinking. So this is the bottom, the microsocial violence. And it's interesting, but we'll get into that a little bit more as we're looking at different forms of microsocial violence. The overview of technology's dual potential to cause harm and also healing. And so this is a kind of paradox of technology. It's not by default that technology is useful or by default that it's harmful. It can be both at the same time, and it can be neither. It can be useless also. And in this instance, I think I'm talking about digital technology, because technology is a broad word and it's always been with us since ancient man. And I want to then just qualify that when I talk of technology, sometimes I may mention it, I'm really talking about digital technology and in many situations, online technology. I'll talk about the purpose and the scope, the purpose for which we are using this approach and the scope within which I'm applying it. I've already mentioned that in some ways, I'm really talking about the African condition, and then at the same time, I'm really narrowly focused on Kenya, within which most of my examples will come. But I do have other examples as well. And the methodology is using a scientific approach where I scored through the literature and I put together what I could find to support the arguments that I'm making. I also use case studies. Many of the case studies I'll talk about are experiences that I've had personally during research, and some are outside my own research. And then I'll talk about, well, framework analysis I won't talk about, not in detail, because that I think is the subject of a whole talk. So I had to remove it from this one. I thought I might have time, but it looks like 25 minutes will be over before I get to this framework analysis. So I'll just on it, and if you like, we can discuss it verbally. So for now, this is what I'll cover. That's the introduction. So let me start with the conceptual foundations. Defining conflict-sensitive environments. Now, whenever we talk about conflict, unlike many things, people default or tend to default, even I'm guilty of that, to the worst case scenarios. You start thinking of the Gaza, and you're thinking maybe of the Israeli Palestinian conflict, which has been there like forever. Yeah, that's a conflict-sensitive environment for sure. Ukraine, another conflict-sensitive environment. But bringing it closer home, we have conflicts going on in Somalia, which have been perennial, and Sudan, Congo, Mozambique. We have conflict-sensitive environments like those. When I define conflict, or when I talk about defining conflict-sensitive environments, I'm not really talking about wars. I'm talking about, because we're talking about education as a means by which we can reduce conflicts generationally. So I'm talking about the kind of conflict that occurs when you start looking at what goes on when groups come together, or when people are in the same social environment. And there's, let's say, the possibility of competition for resources or for space, for identity. That's really what I'm talking about. These kind of conflicts are more pervasive and much more with us than maybe the kind of conflict we talk about when we get into wars. We're saying that even the war, even the biggest wars, have a genesis, a seed, and it's probably planted at a time when we're young. And depending on our attitudes and behaviors and how we're taught and the kind of skills and knowledge that we acquire when we're young, during those formative years, will predetermine to what extent we have a proclivity to get into battle or into wars. And how we resolve problems and reconcile is determined much earlier on in life. And it's during those years in school that we have the opportunity really to stop, you could argue, World War III, if that is on the cards. So this is the kind of thinking. Conflict-sensitive environments, therefore, are classrooms, schools, places where learners converge. Those are really potentially conflict-sensitive environments. Now, depending on how we set up those conditions and the settings, there could be peace-building opportunities, which is the converse. So this is the paradox. Technology itself reflects this paradox. It can be used as a weapon, or it can be used as an instrument of peace. So I'd like to start then with the characteristics of conflict-sensitive zones. And I'm looking then at instability, trauma, and systemic inequality in this part of the discussion. So when you look at, let's say, the classrooms, let's suppose the classroom is in real space, in person, you're talking about a situation where you have learners. Learners are both, you could say, students and teachers. Teachers are also learners in the learning context. In the same environmental space, you have a social cultural, the possibility for social cultural, let's say, experience, which can be either connected or disconnected. So that's a characteristic of learning. Let me pre-qualify by saying that within the African context, we all know that, let me say, if we don't all know, that African cultures are communal, which means that we live and experience life and also learn in groups or in communal scenarios. And those communal scenarios are necessary for our survival. In other words, we have no choice but to be that way. That's really what I'm saying. And that's reflected in the literature. And it imposes on the learning process the need for learners to not only learn to be independent and capable as individuals, but a requirement for them to integrate their knowledge into society. So learning doesn't end when you have self-autonomy or self-governance. It doesn't end with that. You may be self-sufficient, but for the African, it's a requirement that you integrate that knowledge into society. So the idea of social cohesion is central to the African condition. This is really what this is about. And for a learner or anyone in a learning space, not to achieve this level of integration would simply mean that the learning is not complete. Maybe learning never completes in that way, because we know the dynamics of these things keep changing. So maybe it never completes. But it is important to understand that for the African, it's necessary that knowledge is networked and that we integrate it into the collective. So this idea of conflict-sensitive zones simply means that you're in a social context which requires that you learn socially. And potentially, you may not learn anything simply because of the social cultural disconnection that you find within that space. Let me not move on. I'll just mention that isolated knowledge creation is part of that disconnect. Isolated knowledge would simply speak to an African value that knowledge is networked. Any knowledge that's meaningful is collective. The idea that one person owns knowledge isn't a good one. It's not. When we make good decisions, we recognize that all knowledge is actually the result of a group of people and not just one person. And then unequal access to learning opportunities is troublesome. In the ideal learning condition or circumstance, you would want all genders, all manner of people, in spite of their health, to have access to the knowledge. The equal opportunity is what we're talking about at the point of input. When you're actually starting to learn, everybody should have that opportunity in an equal way. So these are all supported, and not to have that would be considered a conflict-sensitive issue. Hope that's clear. The second thing is differentiating micro conflict zones from micro-socially violent contexts. Again, micro-socially simply means on the ground, at the touch point between the learner and the knowledge, or the learner and, you can say, the learning environment. So again, socioeconomic disconnection and isolated knowledge creation and unequal access would be the enemy of any kind of macro conflict zone. A macro conflict zone would be the global situation. And I want us to, at some point, start to examine the effect of the macro conflict zones with the micro conflict zones, which means the global context with the local context, and how the global context might not automatically be helpful on the ground. And in many cases, might be the cause, you could argue, of conflict and even defeat the purpose or the goal of peace building. And I'm talking about, dominant cultures subsuming smaller cultures on the ground. But we'll discuss that under this topic of macro conflict zones. And then we have examples of conflict-sensitive situations. So I picked up some because this is actually the genesis of my interest in this subject. It started a long time back, but it was, I think, 2018, roughly, when it started. But back then, what was happening was children were burning down schools, students. And that was a phenomenon we found new. It wasn't like that when we were young, but students were burning down schools in alarming numbers. So there was a strong disaffection on the ground between students and learning. And these were secondary school students. And there were enough instances of it, you could say, for people to sit up and take notice. However, I was also interested by our government's response, because the government response was indiscipline, that the students were indisciplined, and as such, there need to be higher levels of discipline to prevent the burning down of schools. Yeah, that might be to some extent correct, but nobody seemed to be asking the question, is there a deeper reason? Do the students have a point? Because the students were disaffected with the learning. They were burning down the schools largely because they didn't feel there was anything to be gained by going to school. And they didn't like school in the first place. So that question on whether students like schools was not being asked. And I was wondering why. If they're the ones who make up the larger population of the learning community, then why would we not want to know why they're burning down the schools? It started with that. But that is in school. Big picture, we have issues with post-election violence, for example. And this happened in Kenya in 2007. And there were large numbers of youth that were in the streets in different towns, especially in the Rift Valley area, burning down houses and buildings. They were burning down everything. And these were youth. You'd wonder about it. Why would youth be actively, passionately involved in the burning down and displacing of families and lots of people within the region? I think, if I remember correctly, about 800,000 people in the end were displaced. So that was an example of the outcome. And it was interesting that youth were very heavily involved in that. And it shocked the country in many ways. So this is a conflict outcome. There's also the case in Nigeria where corporal punishment is practiced in large, I think, across the country. And there was a rebellion against it not against it, but a rebellion in 2023. And I read a paper that was inquiring to what extent corporal punishment contributes to to this kind of rebellion by youth against the system. And it was quite, again, similar to Kenya's, where the youth were burning down, buildings, displacing businesses, attacking people. There was a big disaffection with the system. Now, some of these things, or some of these attitudes, can be, you can say, modeled in school in a way where they encourage peace building so that the disaffection doesn't lead to violence. This is where this is going. We have our own situation in Kenya where Gen Z have, since last year and also this year, taken to the streets in protest against the government. Again, similar in a way, because they're against the system. They don't believe in it. They feel as though it has betrayed them. It has lied to them. The arguments are that they don't have jobs, but now they're hitting the streets. Gen Z are now, that's the age range from 15 years old to 30 years old. So they've started to hit the job market and discovered that there are no jobs. And there never were any jobs. And the situation isn't getting better, it's getting worse. they have to contribute, and they're ready to contribute to society. They can't think of things like marriage, simple things, having children, those kind of normal things. They can't think about that because they are unable to sustain themselves. And they feel strongly that they've been lied to by generationally, by the system, by their older peers. You see, that kind of thing. So this kind of violence is coming from the young, and the young are coming out of school. You can't say that they learned this, let's say, on the streets, or they learned it because they had experiences that led to it. The real experience of Gen Z is from school. School isn't teaching them peace building in, I would say, convincing ways. Maybe the efforts, but the efforts seem to be defeated by the fact that we have so many protests. So whatever effort is being made to teach Gen Z about, let's say, peace and brotherhood and things like that, has resulted in the opposite. So we have to re-examine ourselves and what we have in our curriculums. And that's what I really want to talk about, the problem. Education first strategies mean education is used as a tool for conflict prevention. But this is not preemptive. When you talk about it this way, or at least when I'm talking about it, I mean, we have to be proactive. I have to be this way, in presupposing that even tomorrow, there'll be another strike by Gen Z, or the Nigerians will hit the streets, the youth, and want to see change. Or there could be another situation like we had in Kenya, where we had 800,000 displaced people from their homes. We should think about the possibility of this happening in the future so that we can be proactive in the way in which we go about tackling the problem in schools. And that's what I mean by prevention. We shouldn't wait for the last minute, which is more preemptive. And we shouldn't be reactive, for sure, which is what we are. We react when the thing happens. And then, of course, the reaction is not the best way of handling the problem. So using education first strategies are in some ways a proactive approach to tackling violence or peace building generationally. So the first strategy is integrated social learning dynamics. So that sounds like a buzzword, actually. I want to unpack that just to say what I mean by it. It's learning within communal educational environments. Because Africans live, work, and learn in groups as a collective, it makes sense that our curriculum should be communal. It should reflect the outcome from the get-go. This is really what I'm trying to say here. That within our learning, it helps to integrate group dynamics. It helps to consider the collective and building of social cohesion as a core curriculum activity, not just as a learning activity, but also as an examining activity. But as I speak to you, this isn't the case. We're very subject-oriented still. And there's a shift, a new curriculum that's been introduced. But it doesn't, in some ways, in many ways, go far enough in infusing the African value of communal, collective accountability and responsibility. Why I say it is largely because the examining method isn't still collective, it's individual. People are still separated, and you have to account for your own grades, which is okay, but it's insufficient. We know in the African condition, you need to go a step further and also be accountable for your brother and your sister's grades, you see. And that's not part of the examining method. So we're now asking this kind of question: to what extent should it be? So there's a buzzword here called pro-social, but it just means social attributes in a positive way. We should start thinking of embedding pro-social behaviors to shape future responses. And this should start in school, and it should start in early childhood. If it does, then at least we can be certain we have an opportunity to create a more empathetic group of children as they grow through primary school. The co-creation of social norms, the rules that govern society, through community-based participation is something that should be actively part of our curriculum. Co-creative or co-created content reflects the African value of all knowledge is constructed or socially constructed. This networked knowledge is something that allows people to form, you can say, cohesive working groups, and then to own the knowledge, its good and its bad side. Sometimes the knowledge is not so good, sometimes it's not so accurate, but the co-ownership of it is something that is helpful, because you know that you're all responsible for the outcomes. You know you're the ones who created it, and you're actively maintaining that information. So when I myself go into class, the classroom in itself is not designed to be co-creative. For example, at university level, there's a curriculum, but the curriculum in the university is not changed. Let's say for 10 years, it's not changed, but that can go on indefinitely. It's not updated or improved or changed or revised regularly enough. But culture on the ground is changing every 6 months. In fact, it changes dynamically all the time. But within 6 months, you may see visible optical differences in the culture and the behavior of people. But the curriculum that is preparing you, let's say, for the workplace, a workplace which is changing also every 6 months now, is not changing with 10 years past. That's a very long time. I mean, the curriculum I remember teaching on was last, you can say, approved 15 years ago. 15 years, it's completely outdated. So in that sense, you can see how irrelevant or useless such a curriculum would be when the culture on the ground, which is influenced by technology, is changing, let's say, on a month-by-month basis. So that is something to really think about. There are reasons, which are reasonable reasons, why it's difficult to change the curriculum so quickly at the base of culture itself. And one of them is socioeconomic, which, it's expensive to do that. And that's reasonable, but we do have to find a solution. Maybe we should write the curriculum in a way that doesn't require change. Why? Because it's naturally in a state of flux all the time. These are the considerations that haven't been given even to our basic education curriculum in primary and secondary schools. And then we have reinforcement of empathy. So this is a very important one, which goes under the radar very quickly. But I'd like us to focus on these three types of pro-social areas and try to dig down a little bit deeper to see the nature of the problem. Empathy is important. So on one hand, the individual has some capacity to empathize with another peer, but you can say in a different way, an individual has the capacity to understand the group, the social behavior. And what we're saying is that this should be a requirement, not only in the learning activities, but in the examining activities, so that we can know to what extent learners are actually learning or building this capability, which is a positive pro-social behavior, the ability to understand and to have empathy. So the second strategy, education first strategy, is differentiating the micro and macro conflict zones. Conflict sensitive modeling for learning. This is very important, but I'll start with the micro. From a micro perspective, I think in general we all agree, I mean, many educators would agree that scaffold learning through cultural relevant tools and methods is something that is central to the learning process. But what I mean by scaffolding or scaffold learning is learning that is supported by others. In other words, you don't learn alone, even though you can, like reading and writing. Those are isolating experiences, but you can learn by doing that. But there's a limit even to that. I mean, in as much as you can learn by reading and writing, maybe watching videos these days alone, your learning will take a particular path and will be limited by your own scope. The minute someone is introduced into your space who has a broader scope or the capacity to improve your own scope, you'll find that learning will take a different dimension. And if you have a whole, let's say, group with whom you are working with, the influence will have this proportionate impact on your learning. You'll see things in different perspectives, dimensions. And beyond that, if you work and look at your community of learners that are within your space of learning, and you learn through that community,
I believe you're frozen, but it might be me. It is me.
yeah, sorry. Okay. So I'm really looking at the broader picture that brings in the more human skills that are necessary for you to be part of a social group that is accountable and responsible for the construction of knowledge and even its dissemination. So it goes beyond the individual. Scaffolding, or this scaffold learning through culturally relevant tools and methods explains a micro situation, a micro social situation where people can learn in meaningful ways. So that's what really I mean by micro learning, and also learning at the touch point where the knowledge is. It's very important that as you learn the subject, you're also learning the social skills. Now, if we're talking of peace and peace building, then peaceful interaction practiced through peripheral participation is necessary. But what do we mean by peripheral participation? What we mean is that if you have a group, a learning group, usually we categorize them by year. So you could be maybe your first year in university, or you could also be in standard 1. You have a learning group, and that's your class, your classmates and your peers. They're all part of your learning group. You become, you can argue, peripheral participants in the construction of knowledge. There's the center of knowledge, but you are a legitimate player within that community in constructing that knowledge, even if you're in standard 1. This is how to look at it in the ultimate way. So the young folks can come in, be shown the rules. There'll be a teacher, show them this is how we do it. And they participate actively, not only in learning, like absorbing and acquiring knowledge, but also in constructing, and not individually alone, but as a group, to the knowledge base that exists, which has its own center. You see, that legitimizing of even standard 1s as active carriers of knowledge is helpful if we're going to work as a collective to come up with rules and norms and systems that make sense and are agreeable to all of us generationally. The thing that we obviously have to engage in is peace building as a value and other values. Now we're focused on peace and look at what we might call anti-violent behaviors as negative and try to discourage that. Now, just in a classical way, but we'll get into it a little bit more, things like cyberbullying, or let's say feelings of isolation that happen in social groups are things that can be addressed and should be addressed, even when children are in early childhood and enter into the knowledge space. And we can learn from them. I think this is also the way to look at it. But if you have a curriculum that is linear or directional, unidirectional, it's very difficult to learn from students if the knowledge is, let's say, with a teacher and you're imparting it to the students. And it's even worse when the students are trained to accept that, because they know they're not supposed to contribute anything. They're supposed to just absorb. That kind of thinking, we know, is a flawed and very narrow way of looking at knowledge. From an African perspective, it's a killer. That's what's killing us, because knowledge is not constructed in that way. Knowledge is owned by the community of learners. And then the idea of observing and imitating pro-social peer responses. So in as much as peripheral participation involves having people there with whom you can interact with, sometimes it's your peers, sometimes it's your teacher, Sometimes it's an older person, someone who is in school but older than you. They are all peripheral players at different levels of contribution. In as much as we have that, we also have peer responses. Peer responses are very powerful way of learning. And I think, and I feel it's also unfortunate, I don't see enough, not only peer learning activities within our learning spaces, but I don't see enough peer examining going on. And this is at school level. It's almost like, we are very dependent on centralization when it comes to exams, but also the same thing happens at the level of learning, of learning activities. So young folks learn by observation and imitating. We all learn this way. And what we need to include within our curriculums are these pro-social peer responses. And in this way, improve on our curriculum simply from the feedback that we get from the learners. That doesn't happen, and it needs to happen if we're going to build peace into our society. So that's just a comment I'm making, but it's not me alone. Some people also believe this. So looking now at the macro dynamics, we have the SDG, the Strategic Development Goals 4 and 16 from the United Nations. I thought that is not a bad place to start when you start looking at the global situation. So these SDGs, they manage civic, or let's say model civic behavior and learning for peaceful societies. That's what SDG, these two SDG, what they do or what they handle are civic modeling and peaceful societies. But let's look at SDG 4. SDG 4 ensures inclusive, equitable, and high quality education. And SDG 16 ensures peace, justice, and strong institutions. Now, these global rules are helpful. They're not at cross purposes, you could argue, with our national or even community level objectives. It's only that when you implement them using, let's say, technology, there's a cultural bias. And that cultural bias can affect the capacity of learners to learn. And that, in that context, can affect our capacity to have peaceful societies, simply because the pro-social learning methods are not passing through in ways that learners own and also learners feel accountable for. So let me move then to pedagogies for peace building. These are the stories that comprise the strategies from a learning perspective. I'll start with this one, dialogic engagement and emotional reinforcement. It shapes social behavior through modeled interaction. What I mean by dialogic, or what is meant by it, is knowledge that is acquired by discussing. That's really what I mean by dialogic. And discussions should increase learner engagement when they're done well. And why I say for us Africans to do this well, we need to look at engagement as something that is two-way, so that peer-to-peer interaction is taking place, and then you can argue teacher to learner interaction is taking place. In the ideal setting, there'll be also older learners, older in the sense of the knowledge that's being learned with more experience, who would also be part of this discussion. In other words, dialogic engagement is not linear. It's more generative. It's just generated based on the way in which learners interact with each other. And that's another interesting thing. If you look at the nature of knowledge that's networked, you'd find that every cohort going through a curriculum would actually have a different thing that they're learning, because their pro-social skills would be different. There'll be variances, and that variability, one could argue, is it good? Well, it's necessary, I would say. When you look at the nature of society, if you assume that every curriculum for standard 1 is the same in every, let's say, classroom, and then every county in every country, it's the same curriculum. Are we speaking to the reality within society? Is that correct? It might turn out, and research is showing the same thing, that every classroom actually has its own curriculum. And it's to that extent that we need to be adaptive. The interesting thing is that the technology today, the digital technology, allows for that. It allows for deeply, not even customized, but I would say deeply adapted learning to take place, where every classroom can have its own curriculum and simply base it on, you can say, a scaled curriculum that recognizes the top, which you could say is global, coming from the UN, national, school-based, and then you could say classroom-based, but also to the point of the individual. It can be adapted right down to the individual. And I think if this is possible, then the Africans, this is a good time to be an African, because the technology that comes into the classroom will allow you to learn in ways that suit your learning, let's say, style or your learning approach. So emotional reinforcement speaks to the pro-social knowledge that we need to accompany now the content within any subject that we learn. So this is what I'd like us to just look at. Maybe we'll discuss it afterward, but we have to look at it from a problem. It's helpful. Let me not say we have to, but it's helpful to look at it from a problem-solving perspective. And if we are peace building, then the problem would be what would be the challenges of peace building. And then we can start to itemize the more violent or even conflict-related issues that arise when we're discussing any topic using this kind of engagement. The other one is reflective pedagogies. Reflective pedagogies are important if we are to build empathy. We need to think about what we're saying and what we're doing. So it's very helpful. In the context of dialogic engagement, you find shared experience and discussion should be part of the learning activities. They should even be central to the learning activities. So the idea of having a sage on the stage where a teacher is simply talking to the students and the students are passive is what we're saying we should avoid if we want to build peace. And then reinforcement of empathy. The fact that you're in an actively performing group will mean that you have opportunities to create consistent emotional, or to get consistent emotional feedback and peer affirmation within the group. For example, if you have, let's say, an activity that you give to students, it could be mathematics, and you find that 3 out of 10 students are able to follow the method that you've given, but 7 out of 10 cannot understand. It's good to introduce the idea that these 3 people should become teachers within themselves and take responsibility for the learning of their peers. And this can be done through a number of group strategies, like pairing or putting them in groups that have different skills that each one brings to the group, so that they can now start to teach each other. And then, as a way of, let's say, it's just an example, but as a way of building empathy, positively reward that activity, or positively reward those who actually engage in this kind of sharing and teaching. Now, sometimes, depending on culture, you may want to reward by giving stars or badges or things like that, but you may also want to reward just by praise, by asking the other peers to say what it is about their peer that they felt was good in the way that they learned from the peer. What was good in their method? What was good in their style? So that is peer-to-peer acknowledgement. This kind of critiquing is very helpful in building empathy, so that you put yourself in the other's shoes. the one who is learning puts themselves in the one who's teaching shoes, and the one who's teaching puts themselves in the one who's learning shoes. This is a peace building mechanism. Again, it's a learning activity I don't see reflected very well in the curriculums. And yet, it is something that would help create group cohesion and a much more empathetic society going forward. A second pedagogical strategy would be participatory social learning. And this speaks to the collaborative co-creation of content or of knowledge. Participatory learning is situated. It's happening at the point of learning, and it's happening in a collective environment. So you have a community of learners, and they're all actively involved to different levels, of course, in the construction of knowledge and the sharing of information. It's a collaborative construction of knowledge, shared, let's say, rules building practices through observation and engagement. So some of the cognitive things like observing and imitating, those skills can be learned. I mean, learning can happen using observation and imitation, while learning, you can say, subject material, as well as these pro-social skills. This can happen at the same time. The only problem we have is, at the moment, is that the pro-social skills are not examined, and as such, they're not even, in many, many instances, they're not even documented in our curriculums as learning activities. So all that is focused on is the subject material. So the idea of collaborating in meaningful ways to co-construct knowledge is lost. We lose the opportunity for peer-led modeling. Peer-led modeling is simply where learners also construct knowledge that enters into the curriculum. This never happens. You'll never find students coming up with knowledge, and then that knowledge is part of the curriculum in a way that will be examined. That I just don't see it. Maybe it's in the space I'm in, but in many places I've gone, the curriculum is cast in stone. Culturally, guided peer learning for conflict resolution is very important. And we can learn from children. We can learn when things come up that we may not have thought would be issues. Would be very good to see, and also to include within the learning space, and then come up with learning and examining methods to try to acknowledge that what we've learned that can be helpful in conflict resolution. And then we have reinforced cooperation. So this is to do with feedback, where group-based pro-social reinforcement can happen when people are critiquing and sharing about their experiences in learning. Reinforcement is a valid form of teaching, but I think what tends to be missing sometimes is the feedback that relates now to behavior, so that we're actually rewarding and recognizing the knowledge that comes through social cohesion. And then we have relational cultural modeling. This is important in the African context because African cultures, when you go back to the question, what is African? Africans are relational, which means that we share information according to nations. We are friends, we are peers, we're colleagues, and we could also be related, kins. But this relational culture is very important. It's part of the fabric, the core fabric of the society. So relational cultural modeling within the classroom would be very important because we can ask the question, what are the rules for relational modeling? Because of the diversity I talked about in the beginning, such modeling needs to be adaptive. Everyone is different. We all come from different backgrounds. We speak different languages in many cases. So we need to have a means by which we can share different ideas and adapt them into our, you could say, curriculum, so that our learning space is made up of these different ideas. So relational identity is an issue with us. Ethnic cultural identity and cultural responsive learning would be helpful. If you're learning mathematics, for example, it should not be treated as a kind of gospel truth. It's helpful if we can ask questions like, how can this mathematics be useful, let's say, in my village? Or how can the mathematics help me in, let's say, in the biology of fishing? You see, so you have this kind of cross-disciplinary approach to learning mathematics, or even you could say multidisciplinary way. So relational identities help us to construct meaning within the subject area in, you can argue, social context. And the social context should never be lost. Culturally responsive, in other words, the knowledge should be culturally relevant and should mean something on the ground. There is the idea of democratizing knowledge, to democratically co-construct holistic narratives. Holistic narratives speak to narratives that recognize the diversity of the people who are constructing the story. And if it's done democratically, it fits into our national, constitutional coming together. So this is part of what happens when we start integrating and adapting our knowledge in relational learning contexts. And then comes feedback, local feedback. If you're talking of a culturally adaptive system, then you have to listen to the ground, because information in culturally adaptive environments are generative. Information is generated from one end, you could say from the top, and the other end as well, from the bottom. Student-led inquiry reinforces ethical and collective responsibility. These are values that help us to avoid clashing. They help us to build a much stronger interdependent bond between ourselves, our peers, not just within our classes or classrooms, but within the learning communities of schools and beyond. So this is how I would talk about the pedagogies that come up in the literature quite often as being very important when it comes to building. So let's look at the problem from a misaligned technological framework perspective. And in this, I just want to mention that the alignment problem is the devil in the detail, where institutions are blind, literally, to what goes on in the classes, in the classrooms. So you have universities where the administration has no clue about how learning is actually happening within the classroom. So that's one level. But another level, which is even more alarming, is that in many instances, the administration is not really interested in whether or not the learning has happened. The interest, as we have discussed with my colleagues many times, is in the grades. Have you awarded the grades? But not how you award the grades and whether the learner is learning in the first place. This is not a discussion that is had within very many meetings in higher education. The same applies also to secondary schools and primary schools to different levels. But the whole idea of learning taking a back seat is troublesome. If you're going to use it as an instrument of peace, then it needs to take the front seat, not the back seat. So this misalignment of technological frameworks is trying to say that the policy itself is not aligned to the practice within the classroom. And this is the devil in the detail. So the problem manifests then in misaligned frameworks or models. We'll start with this one, the cultural imposition, where dominant cultures, habitually subsume, you can argue, less dominant cultures. And why this is troubling in education is because education has a cultural bias. Even the technology that implements the education has a cultural bias. So in the situation that I'd like to talk about, where we're talking about ed tech or digital technology tools, you find that it's very easy to find yourself in class and culturally dislocated by the technology within the classroom. And it's simply because the technology has a cultural preference or a cultural bias. A classical example would be how imported technology overrides indigenous behavioral frameworks. Just to give an example, European Western cultures, the goal of education tends to be self-governance. And your capacity to be self-governing would be a reflection of the level of education that you've received, or how well integrated, or how capable you are to survive within those societies. If you are independent, then you're quite well able to survive within the society. Now, in Africa, it's not like that. It's the diametric opposite. That while it's important to be independent, that's only a stage in learning. One has to go beyond that and become integrated into society. So if you have a technical, let's say a tool that you use within the classroom, and that tool is providing a means by which you can do learning activities and then self-assess yourself, and having achieved that, move on to the next learning experience and repeat the same thing. If that's what it's doing, you can probably cover the material without talking to anyone and be perfectly assessed by that instrument. So a lot of the technologies that come have this self-assessment capability. It's an isolating experience. From the African context, we can ask how good is that, or how helpful is that when it comes to these pro-social skills that we're talking about. For example, if there's no peer interaction in meaningful ways, no co-construction of knowledge, then how can that help us, let's say, build peace amongst ourselves by recognizing our differences, or by trying to have empathy enough to understand perspectives that are not ours? You see, so that cultural bias in itself means that the African context or the indigenous context is lost. So there's no situated learning. Situated learning is where you learn within the context of its application. So you learn according to how you're going to apply your knowledge. If there's no local input, or the instrument you're using is blind to the local emphasis or focus, then again, very quickly, the opportunity to build social or pro-social skills is lost. Now, in other cases, you have a communal misalignment, where achievement focus, for example, in the West, weakens relational reinforcement. What I mean by this is, in Western communities or societies, there's a strong emphasis on being competitive. In African societies, there's a strong emphasis on being cooperative. And in many ways, these can be a tandem. Not always. They require alignment. You can be competitive if it's aligned to being cooperative. So your being competitive or your achievement, your personal achievements that you are gaining are aligned to the collective, you can say, responsibility to learn. If cooperation is aligned with competitiveness, then it works. But if that's a silent issue, then the dominant culture is likely to impose its own method. So if that method is to be competitive or hyper-competitive, as cases, then the culture that's not hyper-competitive might find itself disadvantaged or somehow alienated because of this misalignment. This constructive alignment is troublesome. Technology that we use for learning online, for example, is not developed in Africa. It's developed in the Far East or in the West or the Far West. So that needs to be treated independently, and we need to ask questions as Africans. How can we introduce pro-social methodologies or techniques or knowledge using these tools? And even if it means redesigning the tools, then we should be actively involved in redesigning them. So the colonial residue in digital curriculum design is something that is ever present in our curriculums. We see it in the arguments that are raised around the decolonization of our own curriculums. But I'm just, for now, not using that term. I'll use the term colonial residue. Because the arguments of decolonization almost suggest that the devil is still in the room, if I may call it that. But the answer is yes, the devil is there, but the devil is not the colonial. The colonial left a long time ago. The colonizers are not here. Now, we are the devil is in us. And we are implementing the same tools in the same ways the colonial implemented them within the classroom context. And we need to ask ourselves, to what extent is this disenfranchising our children? And beyond that, how can we then reconstruct these tools in ways, and sometimes you may have to just adapt them and localize them fully from the ground. So how can we rebuild these rules and tools in ways that make sense to our learners? There's an epistemic displacement in modeling of learning that takes place when we do not originate information with the ground game in mind. When we come with Eurocentric curricula, it can undermine, in fact, in many cases, it undermines the local learning models and completely subsumes them. When we have, like I was showing, Gen Z or even young youth burning schools and being disaffected with the kind of knowledge we show them, if you listen to them, they're saying that we know that this is not going to get us jobs. If we learn this way, we'll not get jobs. That's one. But they also say things like, we also know that a lot of these things are irrelevant. Why do I have to do mental sums? It's a simple thing, but it's a serious question. You have to have this capacity to do mental sums. I mean, if you don't answer it in the way that makes sense to the learner, they might feel that you're cheating them because they have alternative ways of getting the answer. They don't have to know the times table, which we had to know during our time. You see, it's just an example of placing the learning in the situation that you find the learner. There's disjointed participation. And then in disjointed participation, you have non-local platforms ignoring communal learning practices and rituals. So a lot about Africa is ritualistic, not in a traditional sense, also in the way in which we just do things. If the platform that's used and the tools that are used for learning alienate the learner so that they feel as though the content and also the subject material is alien to them, they'll be isolated. There'll be a sense of breaking in the learning. So even the idea that we can start to introduce communal, or you could say relational skills, that conversation will not even happen. And then the feedback, the reinforced feedback gaps which exist. Cognitive rewards disrupt relational harmony and feedback systems. So here what I'm really saying is that the feedback has gaps in itself. If the global system, which is the technology, is blind to the kind of society that it's being implemented in. Oftentimes, this has happened when I'm implementing e-learning. The technology owners tell me to change the culture, literally, by asking the people in the group to learn to do things the way the technology was made to work. So you're asking the participants within the workshop in e-learning to change the way they have always worked, to learn to use the technology and meet the technology on the technology front. This is a common thing. But I've had big problems with it. What if you're working with older people? Like when we had COVID and we had to now digitalize the lecturers. You have to digitalize professors. Professors have been teaching for 60 years. So you're telling the professor to stop everything that they know is now invalid, or a lot of what they know and the methods are not valid. We need now to start to adopt the method of the technology. Is that the best way? So I found it's not, if you're going to create a cohesive learning environment, that's not the best way to do it. the technology itself needs to be the one to adjust, to fit into the local knowledge if you want to have success with bringing on people who are subject specialists, like professors, for example. So I had that.
Martin,
Go ahead. Yes, yes.
Sorry that I have to interrupt you.
Yes.
I would like to, first of all, thank you so much for this great presentation. And
Yes.
As I'm just conscious of time, I would like to allow, some, people to ask a few questions. And
yes.
So, yeah, well, we still have some like 15 minutes. If we could also hear some questions and comments, and then that will also enrich this great presentation. And we can carry on also, of course, another day as well, if you are available, so we can proceed with that. So if you agree, please let me ask Mary, she has raised her hand, to go first. Thanks.
Okay,
Okay, thank you, brother. Thank you, really great. You are an art professor. Thank you. And I confused what is high quality education in art. And I know many artists all over the world, they learn art from African people. And then they back to college and the university, they teach the Africa culture and the arts. And then they told the student, this is the best for the high quality art, education art. And then they back to Africa, they also teach African people, told them, this is a high quality education in art. But the root from Africa, I confused, what is the high quality education in art? I think African art is the best all over the world. It's a highly quality. I confused.
Okay. This is Mary. Mary, I didn't quite understand the nature of the question. Maybe you can ask it in a sentence, or somebody else can translate it for me in a way that I can understand. I didn't quite understand the question. Sorry about it, but it's my problem.
Anyway, so as we go through that, I would like also to ask two more. I saw Eda and Evelyn wanted to say something. Then Mary can put that question in chat, just one sentence briefly, please.
Oh,
Eda.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Khamala, for your great effort to decolonize the African classroom.
Yeah.
You made very important points, and in particular, in your opening remarks about who is an African, what does it mean to be an African, etc., etc. And I just wanted, this is just a comment and something that probably you want to think about when you are considering that question, even as you go to develop these pedagogical approaches.
Yeah.
If you could consider Francis Nyamcho's work of incompleteness, it is not, even when we do not know who we are as Africans, it's not a flaw. It's not a problem, because then that is an opportunity for us to be creative, to figure out what we can do to define ourselves. And that, I think, would really complement how you want our classrooms to look like. And then, gosh, you mentioned one thing that really touched my heart about the dormant curriculum that we have. I say this respectfully, Khamala. I am really sad that we have institutions of higher education that do not take accountability seriously. Our classrooms, either at the university or in secondary school, are the way they are because the institution and the government, nobody takes accountability. I can teach with my notes from 20, name it, or 1930, and nobody cares about whether I am in classroom on time. Students are so scared. All these things we've got, I hope, please, in your implications for policy, you can strongly critique this and call our institutions to, to accountability. Thank you so much for I don't have a question for you, but you just touch things that I have been thinking about seriously, about how we can teach about peace when we are in an environment that is so unwelcoming. Thank you. And I also want us privately to talk about the intergroup theory. How can we get people to talk? So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ada. Do we turn to, Richard, please go next.
Thank you so much, sir. You really made my afternoon a great one. In fact, these approaches for the governments are already there, but with connecting it to peace building, peace study, or conflict within them, this is what we are lacking. And today, you've made me, you've prompted me to reopen my style of everything. I'm so blessed today. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. And now I see also Mary's question. It's about quality education. Probably in the context of Africa, if you would like to say something about it, you may respond, and then we'll invite Janet, unless she wants to clarify also, something. But Martin, please go first.
So what is high quality art education in Africa? So high quality art education in Africa. Yeah, I think that's a very deep question, maybe a very big one. I could also invite my research colleagues to also add something. But what in my mind, I think in many people's minds, high quality education in art would mean, or would be one, education that is relevant, which means it is, if you're talking of art, there's a sense in which there's the work that's produced by the artist is owned by the community that produces that work. It was something I was discussing with my professor the other day, Professor Odoch, that, we have embraced art education very much in the image of the West. And what's troubling about it is that when you look at something important like earning from your trade, you find that artists own their work and try to monetize their work through, you can say, copywriting. I think with art, it's copywriting. In other contexts, it's patenting. But you need to own these copyrights to sell your work and promote your image and grow individually so that you can thrive as an artist. That model works pretty well in Europe to some extent. I mean, people become famous and make a lot of money from it. But in Africa, or in Kenya for sure, artists are impoverished. And that's a very sad story in some ways, because they produce actively knowledge. We need to think of a model that is much more socially accountable. And even the construction of artwork should not be, in my mind, an isolating experience. I think if one was to produce artworks that were somewhat socially constructed, then the same society that's buying the artwork would be feeling a sense of ownership with that knowledge. This kind of thinking is not prevalent here, but good art education, and even to salvage fine art as a study, I think we need to start to reconceive how artists can monetize their trade. And it's not just about the monetizing of it, but it's these pro-social skills we're talking about. The idea that art can be used as a tool for peace building. It can be also used as a tool for learning or a tool for, let's say, restoring history, things like that. When you start thinking like that, then you start constructing social meaning with art. And in that sense, I think art can be center stage again. And then, in my mind, that translates to meaningful quality art education. But again, this is just a very personal way of looking at it. I know Professor Dodge might be able to add to that because he's had, he has had experience with the artists in this area. Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
But very, very briefly, the problem with the question is quality. Because it presupposes that there are other art education or forms of art education which are non-quality. If the question were what forms of art education are here, it would be easy to answer. It also presupposes or in fact brings in the old dictum that when it is made at home, it is not as good as it is made abroad. I think this is my problem with the question. So I would have preferred to answer, but I like the way you answered it. But the problem with the question is in quality. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Odoch. Let's go to Janet and Evelyn. Evelyn, Janet, you are muted.
Evelyn first, please, because she had her hand up first. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to defer, Janet.
Oh, we could discuss it. Peer learning. Okay, here's my comment. Thank you for your really marvelous presentation, really quite comprehensive. And one place, I work in peace education, so, we could talk further, but one part that I think could get more attention is it really struck me when you're explaining that the digital creators who create these forms, and then that's what you're supposed to teach, and the whole digital world is so foreign to many educators, right? So there's a kind of, as Terry Sacco said in this conference, she said, you have to focus on the liminal spaces, the spaces of the unknowns, and you're going to come to more knowns. And so in a way, teach your education towards the capacities for facilitation. Like, how do you form the questions for the students? How do you help elicit from the students where the gaps are in their learning, or the or approaches or misunderstandings between this foreign thing, which is electronic and non-human still, and learning for students. So that's my point. Thank you. Facilitation, teacher education. How would that help with your project? Thank you. Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Evelyn, please.
Yeah, well, actually, it follows on nicely from what Janet mentioned. First, three things. First of all, I'd just like to emphasize something that's in the chat from Hubert, who unfortunately had to leave. And he did say that he would like to have a discussion with you about his experience with technical learning. So just highlighting that request from somebody who had to leave. It's in the chat. And I was struck by your reference to the rigidity of curricula, and I was thinking whether it was more flexible to change the teacher training, that there would be, to bring your ideas to the teacher training side of it while the curriculum catches up. So that would be one question. And the other one, I wanted to just mention that Modelo University in Mexico has introduced that every single student, regardless what they are studying, whether it's engineering or whatever, it is mandatory that they take a culture of peace. Well, they call it a life learning course. So they've introduced a system where every single student in every walk of life has to first take a culture of life course, which focuses on the SDG 416 and others, and also many of the points that you raised in your excellent presentation. So the question was really, as an entry point, would it be more, would you get there faster through teacher training than through curriculum development? Because the teacher can then, your question on mathematics, a well-trained teacher can take any curriculum, presumably, and then link it to the contextual issues you're discussing.
Yeah, if I may
Yes.
answer, can I respond or?
Yes, please go ahead. And
Okay.
yes, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Evelyn. I think, and also Janet. Yeah, what you're saying is very practical and it's very reasonable, actually, because of, trying to fit so many complicated layers of things into, let's say, an already busy schedule for everyone. And teacher training is important, so you can't ignore that. So what you've said is, the answer I'd say is yes, that this can solve the problem, but it'll solve it partially. I've seen with common courses in the university, students and also lecturers don't take them seriously. They see it to be a necessary evil because we have to get our degree, we have to do this common course, so we do it, get it out of the way, and then we move. They don't see it as part and parcel of their core studies. So what happens, if you're studying a course like medicine or engineering, they're taught in a very sterile environment, very abstract. And you learn the trade, you learn the skills, then you go and practice. But when you go to practice, you're working with human beings in real situated contexts. And if you don't have empathy and you're a doctor, I think you'll be a killer in some ways. I mean, you'll be dangerous to your patients in many ways. Now, some people have the empathy because that's their nature. Other people don't have it. But I think it speaks then to a much more integrated approach towards these pro-social skills, like empathy and communication. Some engineers don't know how to communicate at all. And communication is so poor that, many projects suffer from this, you can say almost hostile method of communicating. And yet these are just basic pro-social skills. But integrating them is difficult. And for some reason, curriculums are just made in the abstract. And then the values are sometimes listed at the back, but nobody takes them seriously. So what happens is that we have people who come out into the professional space, and something simple like working in a team is not easy. And it's in some ways you can't blame them. The curriculum in that sense failed them because it didn't make it a learning activity and an examining activity to learn to work in a team, in a group. So sometimes even teams are not performing, and as such, we have a lot of failure that happens within the continent that is happening not because people aren't well trained. It's happening because we just don't seem to have the means by which we can translate what we're doing to the real world. That's the devil in the detail. We probably have to be much more integrated in our approach to curriculum building and learning. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you so much, Martin, for this great, brilliant presentation. And as you know, you are leaving us, wanting more. We need more from you. So please come again whenever you have time. I know you've got a big, tight schedule, but we can always sacrifice, some time. So thank you so much indeed, and I thank everyone who has been with us today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again Wednesday. And please do invite others also to join us. This is free and it's beautiful. Thank you so much indeed. Bye-bye for now.